Hey, everybody. I'm Dr. Justin Carter. This is going to be the first lecture for the political economy course. This will be a little bit of a difficult course, right? This is senior level class. I'm trying to get you guys ready for law school or grad school or for the business world. So there will be, you know, pretty high expectations in here. There'll be exams that are multiple choice. There will also be papers. They need to be 1,500 words. I believe it's 4 citations and legitimate citations. Not Wikipedia, not Econopedia. Um, let's try to get some real research. Um, we're going to cover a whole lot in this class. I love political economy. It's probably my favorite topic outside of ethnic conflict, which is what I study. Um, but we'll go through sort of a review of each unit. The first unit is going to be called Introduction to the Paradigm, Historical Development, and Income Redistribution, right? So, chapter one is just basically an introduction to the paradigm. Chapter 37, we're going to sort of skip around, so we'll go straight to chapter 37. So, this is going to be about economic and political development. And then we'll talk a little bit about authoritarian governments. Most of the research is going to be about democracies and especially about the sort of developed democracies, right? Europe, Canada, America, Australia. Um, but I did want to touch a little bit on authoritarianism. And then we'll move to electoral systems and economic policies, and then income distribution. And then Unit 2 will start with Self Enforcing Democracy by Adam Jaworski, who's probably my favorite researcher. And then we'll talk about the protection of civil liberties, property, and equality, and sort of how those are the bases for modern democracies. We'll talk about social choice and well being, and then fair division of sort of incomes, right? So this is going to be a more philosophical approach. Unit 3 will cover macroeconomics and capitalism. So we'll talk about monetary policy, central banks, and how independent they should be. We'll talk about political economic cycles, capitalism and its effects on democracy. We'll talk about inequality and its effects. And then we'll close the unit on comparative perspectives on the role of the state in the economy, right? So this is a big sort of Democrat-Republican division in the U.S. How big should the role of the government in the economy be? Okay, Unit 4 will be about international political economy and international relations. So we'll talk about political economy as a discipline in its own. We'll talk about International Conflict by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, who's a very, very famous researcher and has been hired many times by the US government and the CIA and the FBI and others for his work. We'll talk about Fearon's ethnic mobilization and ethnic violence. We'll talk about democracy and war, and then we'll finish the entire course on a chapter on anarchy. Since we talked a little bit about democracy, a lot about democracy, a little bit about autocracy, and then we'll cover anarchy, which is a couple states in Africa, especially. We've sort of seen a rise of coups, especially in Western Africa, and then in Eastern Africa, we have a lot of sort of failed states like Sudan and South Sudan, and so we'll be talking about this sort of the anarchy approach and what to do about it. Okay, so the book opens up with chapter 1, The Reach of Political Economy by Barry Weingast and Whitman. And so it introduces the chapter by talking about how we're going to approach the book. Basically, it says the book will approach political economy as a methodology of analyzing political behavior and institutions, right? So it's a particular methodology. It's a methodology that uses basically Homo economicus, right? individual level behavior of individual humans, assumptions about the way that humans behave, especially the sort of Homo economicus, utility maximization of human behavior, right? And then we'll also talk a tiny bit about gene survival and evolutionary theory. So part one basically opens up, and what they're trying to say is we want to show you ways that this methodology has been used in the past to understand certain aspects of society. And so part one opens up with a discussion of legislatures. And so there have been three historical approaches to studying institutions, and especially legislatures. The first basically takes it that legislatures are a monolithic institution and they're sort of unchanging. And so they take that perspective and they try to understand how legislatures affect society, right? So how does American legislative action and how does the institution itself affect policy and policy outcomes, right? The second takes a comparative approach and says, okay, we'll also sort of assume that legislatures and institutions are monolithic, but instead of studying their effects on a single state or a single society like the U.S., what we're going to do is take all of these sort of empirical and theoretical research paradigms and merge them together basically to understand the differences in those monolithic institutions and how they affect society, right? So say we have a bicameral versus a unicameral system, what are the different effects? Or we have a parliamentary, as in most of Europe, versus a presidential, as in sort of the US and Brazil system, and how do those affect societal outcomes differently, right? And then finally, the third approach, the most nascent or newest approach, is this sort of endogenous institutions approach, right? And it says that institutions are not monolithic and that they sort of evolve and change over time based on the behaviors and the incentives of the individuals and the parties that participate within them, right? And so they want to know, how are legislatures, how are they formed, what do they look like inside of them, and so how does that affect institutional survival, right? And so they give basically 4 examples of how this Homo economicus approach can be used to understand how legislatures behave. And so the very first one is legislative preferences, and this is the very simplest one. And it basically says that the legislation that is passed in the legislature is just going to be based on the median legislator's preferences, right? And so you have this sort of singular ideological line from left to right, and that the policy that will be produced in this House under these conditions is going to be the median legislator preferences, right? Very, very simple. And then we move on to a different model. The second model is committees as commitment devices, right? And this model is different from the first in that it basically says, well, the median legislator preference thing is not true. That's not what we see in reality. We often know that sort of institutions get captured or legislators have sort of lobbying interests. And so the median policy perspective, the centrist policy perspective is not always the one that passes. We also know that sort of log rolling, right, trading votes, exists. I'll pass your little piece of this bill, you pass this little piece that I want, and the compromise will get the bill passed, right? So the problem with this, though, is that when we consider log rolling, we have to consider the future, right? Because these are iterative games. Iterative means it happens over and over, and we'll use that sort of term a lot in this semester. And in an iterative game, these politicians have to work with each other, numerous times over years, right? And so there has to be some way to enforce these log rolling promises. And so the way to do this is to institute a committee system. And the committee system will allow them to sort of place all of the log rolling into a single bill before it goes to the vote, before it goes to the floor for a full vote, right? And so this helps to ensure that the log rolling will be complete. But there's also the idea that each committee has its own tiny jurisdiction, right? Agriculture, foreign affairs, whatever it is. And so because each has its own small jurisdiction, this also helps to guarantee future iterative log rolling, that you won't sort of renege on your promise because your part of the bill has to pass your part of the committee, mine has to pass my part of the committee. And so this is just another sort of check on ensuring that you don't renege on your obligations. Okay, part three, example three is parties as transaction cost reducers, right? And so the idea here is that parties actually serve a role, not just committees, as in the second example, not just individual legislators, as in the first example, but here political parties actually serve an internal role in the party as a solver of collective action problems. It's very difficult. You know, we saw in our founding, when there weren't really political parties and there weren't really factions built yet, it took a while for those things to sort of coalesce in the American system. And it was really hard to pass legislation, right? Because everybody wanted to do their own thing. There wasn't really an overarching organization to ensure that everybody was on sort of the same page when it came to policy. And so it was very difficult to pass legislation. So basically parties come in because they provide institutional support. They produce sort of legislation that caters to all of their members, so they can try to aggregate their voting body. The party is there to develop a national brand so that information is disseminated to voters about where potential candidates likely stand on each individual issue. They collect money for re-election, things of that sort. So the above tools are basically used to re-elect members and to sort of enforce party platforms, right? Okay, so the fourth and final example from legislatures is committees as information providers. This is idea here that committee members legislators can't be experts on all policy, right? And so they need to be able to focus on sort of singular policy issues or sort of smaller segments of what the legislature needs to produce so that they can become an expert, right? And so committees allow this sort of expertise. They can focus on a particular problem or a particular policy issue, or maybe two if they're on a couple of committees. But it allows them to focus on legislation, and this was also another reason for sort of the creation of committees, right? Okay, so we'll move past legislatures and we'll move on to voting. This is kind of interesting because, historical democratic theory said that voters need to be really well informed. They need to be getting their information from non-biased sources, especially, and they need to vote at high levels for democracy to sort of normatively thrive and survive, right? But unfortunately, this is not the reality that we find in survey data or any other data, really, right? Especially in America, voting is low. Across the developed world, interest in politics is low. Knowledge about politics is miserably low. Knowledge about the institutions of the government or how it's funded or the policy perspectives of each party, etc., are miserably low. And so it doesn't really stand up. Oh, and also information is increasingly biased, right? Especially in the internet age, cable television channels are biased. The internet is biased. It discovers, what sort of policies you promote, and then it just sort of tunnels you algorithmically into this deeper and deeper rabbit hole into more sort of extremist and one-sided ideological perspectives, and people sort of get funneled into this stuff, right? And so from all of those perspectives, democracy should be failing because citizens are not good decision makers, right? But there's sort of problems with those implications, especially given voter behavior. And they give a couple of examples, but I'll just focus on the first one, on early election data, right? Some parliamentary countries, they'll obviously have sort of scheduled elections, say every 4 or 5 years, but they can also potentially call what's called an early election if they think they have an electoral mandate and sort of the economy is doing well and society is doing well and their poll numbers are up. What they can do is call an early election in the hopes that they can sort of reinforce their political mandate, right? And then reset the timing of the elections, basically. But what this means, right, is that the party that is setting an early election is probably in the best position that it sees itself in the past few years and in the future few years, right? Because why else would we be setting this election for right this moment? And so voters should have an incentive to be skeptical of a party that is calling an election early, because the idea is that the economy and society are going to do worse after the early election, because why else are they calling it? And so even though sort of voters don't know this from survey data and other data, intuitively, it seems, on the aggregate at least, that voters do intuitively understand this, and that as soon as a party calls an early election, even though conditions are ripe for it, their sort of their approval rating almost inevitably drops after calling an early election, and voters become skeptical of the ruling party at that point. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that doesn't fit with sort of economic theories of the past. Part 3 talks about evolutionary models of human and political behavior. This is really interesting, right? The assumption is that you will maximize sort of your gene survival. Geneticists and sort of Darwinist theorists have moved away from sort of the individual to the gene, right? From some really famous research from the 1970s and 1980s by Richard Dawkins and others says that the gene is the most important thing, not the individual. And so we can explain sort of altruistic behaviors such as a parent sacrificing themselves for a child through these gene survival sort of theories. And we also find the same thing in the animal behavior. If you're a parent or a grandparent, you're much more likely to sacrifice yourself for your children than non-related animals like meerkats. But then even if you're a cousin, you're more likely than non-related animals to sacrifice yourself for a genetic cousin, but less likely than a parent or grandparent. So the statistical findings are very, very interesting that suggest this sort of idea of gene survival rather than individual survival, right? So in that way, we can sort of explain some of these altruistic behaviors that don't fit the sort of Homo economicus model, right? But there's also some really interesting sort of experimental results from some money games. And they've run these games all over the world in all kinds of different contexts, from sort of rich countries to poor countries. And they basically find the same results. And so here's the setup. There's two players, player A and player B. You are player A. You're given $10. You can, or not, offer player B any amount of your $10, right? From a penny to all $10. Or nothing. Player B then has the decision to either accept your offer or reject it, and nobody gets anything, right? If they accept, they get the amount that you offered them and you get the remainder. If they reject the offer, nobody gets anything. And so, from the Homo economicus perspective, right, from a straight game theoretical decision model perspective, um, Homo economicus would have an incentive to offer a paltry exchange to player B, right? 1 penny, let's say, would be the most efficient, right? You would maximize your utility of $9.99 out of the $10 by offering player B 1 penny, right? And so you would be maximizing your utility. Player B would actually be getting something, right? And so they would gain utility. And so under the sort of Homo economicus model, both players are better off, and player B always accepts whatever the exchange is, as long as it's not $0, right? But that is not what we find in reality. We find in reality that when you offer player B this sort of paltry sum, player B gets pissed off and rejects it. And so everybody walks out with nothing. And so the Homo economicus model doesn't really work. Especially in iterative games where you're playing over and over, the players start to learn, okay, I should probably share this closer to 50-50, and that's the sort of behavior that you start to find in iterative, repeated performances of this game. How do you really explain this through utility maximization? And evolutionary theory says basically you can't, right? And then you have to think about things in a different way. And that a reputation for vengeance or sort of retribution can actually be utility maximizing in that it enhances your fitness for survival. Because others in your society or your small sort of hunter-gatherer tribe are far less likely to sort of push your boundaries and gain the sort of vengeance or wrath or whatever it is that you contain as an individual human being, right? And so this is a way to sort of reduce conflict in the future when people learn this reputation as you being a vengeful person, right? And so this is a way to sort of explain away some of this behavior, right? Like they say that there's these pro-social emotions and penalties in our human society that can sort of explain these things, and these sort of punishment reward system that we have in our psychology and our social experiences, like love and shame and empathy and guilt, are important, right? And that if we didn't sort of have these in our society, everyone would be sociopath, and we never would have developed as a species, right? And so, but this is very cognitively different from the Homo economicus argument. This is the idea that, as your society learns these things, and as you sort of distribute this punishment reward social system from love and empathy at the sort of reward end, to sort of maybe murder and exile at the other end of the spectrum, the sort of punishment end, that your social group members, especially, like I said, in these sort of hunter-gatherer societies in our early development, would learn quickly what the rules were within their society after they saw, say, a single murder or a single exile as a punishment for breaking the social group's boundaries or rules, right? So it's just a very different way of looking at the situation rather than the Homo economicus perspective. Okay, the final part of the chapter is based on, they want to show you how you can change the assumptions in a model and get wildly different results, right? And this is not only a strength of sort of the Homo economicus or the political economy approach to science, right? But it's also a weakness in that very small changes to assumptions in your model can make very big differences in the outcomes of those models, right? So, okay, their question here in section 4 is, what is the ideal size of a nation, right? And so that's what they want to approach, and they offer some basic assumptions that will be built into the model, right? The first assumption is that people want their median policy perspective enacted, right? Their second assumption is that if policy were the only thing that we were considering when it came to the size of a nation, each nation would contain a single individual because of their policy preferences. They don't want to have to cooperate. They don't want to have to coordinate. They don't want to have to compromise. And so the sort of equilibrium would be one person, one nation. However, there are other factors to consider, right? And we have to consider two factors, which is production and military. And so under the first model that they build, under those assumptions, we have high barriers to free trade. And so countries can't really develop an international marketplace. And so they have to build a domestic marketplace. And under that condition, a larger domestic marketplace is preferable, right, because of the sort of economy of scale. And a larger military is also preferable. And the larger your population becomes, the larger your military. And the larger your military, the more likely war is successful and profitable. And the smaller your population, the larger your military, the less likely it is that other countries will attack you and that they will not be successful or profitable, right? And so we get very large states under these conditions with very large populations and very sort of warlike tendencies. But when you change the assumptions to no barriers to free trade, the sort of warfare returns are decreased, the profitability and the likelihood of success are decreased. The number of countries increases dramatically and the size of the populations reduces. And the only real conditions under which war is likely are the conditions under which there are extractable resources, right? Especially oil, gold, rare earth materials, lithium, those sorts of things. Whereas sort of high human resource countries like, say, Hong Kong or Taiwan or like Finland or Sweden, right? They don't have really resources you can extract, so they'd be very, very less profitable to attack. All right, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed the first lecture. I will see you soon for the next. Have a wonderful day.